The wind that rises from the strait just before dawn is thin and cold. It moves across stone without caring who once stood there. I know this because I have stood in that wind for most of my life, long after the men who changed the world with it were reduced to names that strangers mispronounce. The rocks remember better than people do. They remember weight and fear and hesitation. I was young then, not young enough to be fearless, not old enough to be wise. I was not a commander, not a hero, not even a soldier whose name would ever be written. I counted ropes, I carried water, I listened. That is how history first reached me, not as destiny, but as murmurs traded between tired men waiting for the dark to thin. They had crossed quietly, too quietly for such a crossing to matter. No banners, no songs, just boats nudged onto unfamiliar shore, wood scraping stone as if apologizing. Across the water behind us lay Africa, solid and known. Ahead, a land none of us could name with certainty, only rumors shaped like fear. Some said it was rich, others said it was cursed, most said nothing at all. He stood apart from us when we landed. Tariq did not pace or shout or lift his face to the sky. He watched the shoreline as if it might speak first. Firelight brushed his armor and failed to claim it. I remember thinking he looked smaller than I expected, which embarrassed me because I had expected something large and unmistakable, the way stories later insist leaders must be. The men whispered anyway. They whispered about the ships, about whether they would be needed again. They whispered about the sea behind us, dark and patient. No one whispered about Spain yet. That word did not exist for us. There was only land. There was only the sense that once feet pressed into its soil, something irreversible had already begun. Orders came without ceremony. Camps were set. Fires were rationed. Silence was valued more than bravery. I learned then that conquest does not begin with shouting. It begins with restraint, with men swallowing fear because there is no audience to reward its display. At some point, later, much later, people would argue about what Tariq said that night, about fire and ships and faith and choice. I was there, close enough to hear his voice when he spoke, and it was quieter than the stories allow. He did not speak to make legends, he spoke to keep men from turning their eyes backward. What he said mattered less than how he stood when he finished, still, rooted, as if retreat was not an idea worth entertaining, not because it was forbidden, but because it was already irrelevant. The sea behind us felt farther away after that, even though it had not moved. I remember a man near me pressing his thumb into the sand, testing it, as if soil could betray us by feel alone. Another stared inland, jaw tight, counting breaths. None of us spoke of kings or empires. We spoke of waterskins and the weight of shields. History was busy being small. Years later, people would ask how it felt to be at the beginning of something vast. I never know how to answer. It felt like standing between two silences, the one behind us that we had chosen to leave, and the one ahead that had not yet learned our names. Somewhere between them, a decision settled into the ground, and the wind carried it inland, slow and inevitable. Morning arrived without announcement. The light slid across the ground as if unsure it belonged to us. Men rose slowly, checking straps, counting breaths again. Hunger was already present, not sharp, but patient. I learned that day how quickly the body accepts new rules when there is no alternative. We moved inland by instinct more than map. Paths appeared because feet found them. Villages watched us from a distance, doors half open, eyes weighing whether we were rumor or consequence. Some fled before we arrived, others stayed and learned that fear has many dialects, all of them fluent. Tariq rode ahead at times, then fell back among us without warning. He asked questions no commander was expected to ask, about water sources, about livestock tracks, about who had passed through recently and who had not. Power, I realized, was not only the ability to command, but the willingness to listen where answers were inconvenient. There were skirmishes, though that word later felt too neat, short collisions of will, dust and shouting, and then a strange quiet afterward, broken only by the sounds men make when they are still alive but no longer whole. We did not linger. The ground kept what it was owed. At night, fires were fewer, conversations were smaller. No one spoke of victory. We spoke of absence, a man missing from the line, a voice no longer answering. I began to understand that conquest is measured less by land gained than by names you stop expecting to hear. News reached us unevenly, a force gathering somewhere ahead, a king who underestimated distance, a court that argued while we walked. These fragments did not feel like intelligence, they felt like echoes from a world that assumed itself permanent. I watched Tariq listen to such reports without satisfaction. There was no smile, no tightening of the jaw, only a brief stillness, as if he were placing weight onto a scale only he could see. Leadership, I thought then, must be a constant act of subtraction. One evening, while guarding the edge of camp, I heard him speak to a man whose armor was cracked and whose courage had thinned. Tariq did not shame him. He did not promise glory. He spoke of endurance as if it were a shared burden, not a test. The man stayed. If you are listening to this now, years removed from dust and fear, remember that most turning points arrive quietly. They do not announce themselves as moments worth preserving. They ask only to be endured, and later to be remembered without embellishment. The land began to change as we moved. Hills softened, air thickened. The silence ahead grew different, not empty, but watchful. I felt it in my chest before I understood it with my mind. Something was aligning, not for triumph, but for consequence. By the time we sensed the weight of what lay before us, it was already too late to pretend we were merely passing through. The ground had learned our footsteps. Whatever waited ahead had learned them too, and it was listening. The first real resistance did not feel like opposition. It felt like inevitability finally noticing us. We sensed it before we saw it, an unease that settled into the pace of walking, into the way conversations stopped finishing their sentences. The land narrowed our movement, funneled us into choices we did not remember making. I remember a riverbank where men washed blood from their hands without speaking. The water carried it away efficiently, as if practiced. No one looked at the current for long. Staring made it harder to keep moving. We learned to look past what remained. Those we encountered were not the faceless enemy later accounts would describe. They were men with cracked leather, with family marks stitched into sleeves, with prayers that sounded different but carried the same urgency. When they fell, the silence afterward felt crowded. I wondered how many stories ended there, unnamed. Tariq did not give speeches after these encounters. He walked among the wounded. He knelt where needed. When he issued orders, they were smaller than expected. Adjust the line, rest here, move before dawn. It struck me that ambition, when stripped of ceremony, looks almost like care. Rumors of a larger force ahead hardened into certainty. Not fear exactly, but density, like air before a storm. Men began checking equipment twice. Jokes disappeared. Even the restless grew still. We were approaching something that would not resolve itself quickly. The night before we faced them, the camp barely slept. I watched Tariq sit alone, back straight, eyes unfocused. He was not praying, he was not planning aloud. He was listening to something internal, something heavier than maps or numbers. I realized then that leadership is also loneliness, carried in silence so others do not have to. When the meeting finally came, it unfolded without spectacle. Noise, yes, confusion, the sense that time had broken into fragments. I remember losing track of direction, of sequence. Only moments remained. Heat, breath, the weight of another body against mine. Victory and defeat felt indistinguishable up close. What followed was not celebration, it was counting. Counting those who stood, counting those who did not, counting wounds that would change men permanently. The field held us all without judgment. The land accepted whatever we left behind. News traveled faster after that, as if the world had been waiting for confirmation. Doors opened where none had been before. Others closed harder. We were no longer an unknown force. We were a consequence that required response. I began to understand that we were not moving toward an ending, but deeper into a process. Each step made the next unavoidable. The ground remembered us now, and memory has a way of demanding continuation, even when the cost becomes clearer with every mile. After that, the land stopped pretending to be neutral. Roads appeared that were meant for control, not travel. Stones were stacked with intention. Towns watched us with the wary stillness of places that had already learned what change feels like before it arrives. We were no longer crossing, we were settling into the shape of things. People came to us without weapons. Some brought keys, others brought silence. A few brought grief that had nowhere else to go. I learned that surrender is rarely about fear. It is about calculation, about choosing which loss can be survived. Tariq received them all the same way, standing, listening, allowing space where pride might have rushed in. He understood, I think, that rule begins not with command, but with restraint. The men noticed, so did the towns. Power shifts do not announce themselves with collapse. They arrive as adjustments, a new authority collecting taxes, a different language echoing in markets, old banners taken down quietly at night. History often disguises itself as administration. There were moments when resistance flared again, sharp and desperate. These did not feel like battles. They felt like refusals, people clinging to what they recognized, even when it had already failed them. When those moments ended, the aftermath was heavier than before. The cost was no longer abstract. One evening, I watched Tariq walk through a settlement at dusk. Children stared openly. Elders did not. He moved slowly, as if aware that every step was being measured by eyes that would remember him long after we were gone. Conquest, I realized, is also a performance forced upon those who never asked to attend. If you have stayed with this story so far, it is not because of triumph. It is because you recognize the weight of irreversible change. Remember that. Not every history worth hearing is loud. Some persist because they refuse to resolve cleanly. News from farther north arrived in fragments, alliances collapsing, authority fracturing. We did not rush. Tariq did not chase collapse. He allowed it to unfold, understanding that speed can shatter what patience might absorb. The men sensed the shift. The urgency changed texture. Less edge, more gravity. We were no longer testing what was possible. We were discovering what would remain after us, whether we wished to shape it or not. At night, I sometimes imagined the land speaking back, weighing us the way we had weighed it, not asking who would win, but what would be left once winning stopped being the question.
Time did something strange after that. It stopped feeling like a line and began to feel like accumulation. Days layered themselves without distinction. Places blurred. What stayed sharp were faces, the ones that watched us arrive and the ones that learned how to live with our presence after the dust settled. Authority spread unevenly. Some regions accepted new order quickly, not out of loyalty but relief. Others resisted through delay, through silence, through small refusals that never rose to open defiance but never quite disappeared either. Tariq understood these subtleties better than most. He did not mistake quiet for peace. I was older by then, not in years but in weight. My hands had learned routines that did not exist before. My voice had learned when not to speak. I noticed how often Tariq chose absence over display, how he allowed local leaders to remain visible, how he stood just outside the frame of power when possible. He was not trying to be loved, he was trying to make continuity possible. There were moments of doubt, not spoken aloud but felt, when news arrived of changes elsewhere, of shifting priorities far beyond this land. I saw the hesitation settle into him like dust. Conquest, it seemed, was not a destination, but a negotiation with forces that did not announce themselves. One afternoon, I watched him read a message twice, then fold it carefully. He did not call advisors, he did not react. He simply sat, looking out over land that had cost more than any accounting could capture. I realized then that victories age quickly, their consequences do not. The people here began to speak our names with familiarity. That, oddly, felt heavier than fear. Familiarity implies permanence. It implies that mistakes will echo longer than intentions. Tariq moved with that awareness, measured now not only by what he took, but by what he chose not to change. If you find yourself pausing here, listening rather than waiting for resolution, that pause is intentional. History does not always move toward clarity. Sometimes it moves toward responsibility and stops there, demanding to be carried. There were departures eventually, orders that shifted focus, resources drawn elsewhere. Tariq prepared without ceremony, no farewell addresses, no marking of endings. He knew that for those who remained, endings would feel different, less defined. On the last night I saw him in command, he stood where the land sloped into shadow, older, visibly so, not diminished but marked. He looked not like a conqueror, but like a man calculating what would be remembered inaccurately. As we moved away, I felt the land release us slowly, as if reluctant to let the story go unfinished. I understood then that conquest does not conclude when armies leave. It lingers, embedded in choices made long after the banners are gone, waiting for the future to decide what it truly meant.
Years later, I returned alone, not as part of any force, not carrying orders or expectation. The land did not recognize me at first. It had learned new rhythms, new names. Markets where armor once passed now traded memory for routine. Children played in languages layered atop each other, unaware of the seams. I stood where we had first landed. The stone was unchanged. The wind was not. It carried voices now, ordinary ones, laughter, disagreement, prayer, the sound of a place that had absorbed change and continued anyway. I wondered how much of us remained and how much had been reshaped into something no one would trace back to that first quiet dawn. Tariq's name lived differently here, spoken sometimes with respect, sometimes with distance, sometimes not at all. That, I learned, is the fate of men whose actions alter structures rather than stories. Their influence survives in systems, not songs. I thought of him often in those days, of the way he stood without spectacle, of how rarely he allowed himself to be the center of the moment he controlled. History would later compress him into symbols he never wore. It would simplify decisions that had never felt clean from where I stood. The people who had suffered most were not the ones chronicled. They were the ones who adapted silently, those who learned new laws without understanding their origins, those who carried loss without language for it. Their endurance outlasted any campaign. If you listen closely to places like this, they do not recount victories, they recount adjustments, the slow recalibration of life after disruption, the way memory dulls sharp edges so survival can continue. I realized then that conquest is not judged by borders drawn, but by how gently or harshly those borders are lived within afterward. Tariq understood that more than most, even if he could not control how time would retell his choices. You may be listening now, long removed from dust and steel, wondering what any of this asks of you. Perhaps only this: to notice the quiet moments where history breathes and to resist the urge to flatten them into certainty. As I left the shore, the wind followed briefly, then turned back inland. The land no longer needed witnesses. It had moved on, carrying the weight of what happened without asking permission, waiting for each generation to decide whether remembering carefully might be its own form of restraint.